All right, hi everyone. Seeing as it's the time to begin, I will now initiate the workshop. Cool. So, thank you everyone for tuning in today. Just a little bit of a short introduction before we start. My name is Brian Wong. I'm currently a first-year student at Oxford and UK, but I'm originally from Hong Kong. Throughout this workshop, if you have any issues whatsoever with the audio quality, if I'm speaking too quickly, too slowly, to using random jargon, and I'm very sorry, I must apologize in advance, that might happen. So please feel free to let me know via messages. If you can contact Angelos and perhaps tell him where you're finding it difficult to catch on to me, then I will definitely try and bear that in mind, and I'll incorporate that as we go along. If you have any direct and immediate questions, please feel free to type it into the comment section on YouTube, and I'll try my best to stay on top of that. The problem only being that I've got really bad internet connection, which is also probably the reason why my visual isn't working very well, along with the fact that my camera is half broken. So I'm very sorry that I'm unable to have the visual component on as well today, but I hope that the audio right now is working and that there's not much difficulty with everyone hearing what I'm saying right now. With that in mind, so I'll officially begin a workshop. The overview of today is we'll cover two major aspects of analysis in general with respect to sex and gender. First of all, I want to take a bit of an introductory sociological approach to talking about sex and gender in general, in theory, some examples and some context about what exactly these very big sounding concepts actually are. And the second part of it is basically to look at how you can apply discussions concerning sex and gender into actual debate context or in discussions about motions, etc. So first of all, in terms of overview, I think it is important to recognize that in most debating, especially when it comes to prepping cases and when you're in OG or in a top half, or even in the bottom half, but like more so when you're trying to lay out the case as a PM, you often have to do an important thing, which is to sort of try and get the context out, which is find something that's going on in the status quo and explain why exactly A, this is relevant, and B, what exactly is it with this context that you're trying to engage with and you're trying to apply to the debate. And obviously in all 8 speeches in a BP debate, you have to contextualize your argument. So you can't just make random points about abstract principles. So I think it's important to realize that my talk today hopefully wouldn't only just be about theory or abstract terms, but also some real life examples where you can use to concretize and explain to your adjudicators what exactly you are talking about. In terms of contemporary trends, what I'm going to talk about interwovenly throughout this entire talk is 3 things. Number 1, an exploration of a diversity of different theories about feminism, about gender, and also about sex. So I'll try and bring in different schools of thought. And obviously in debates, you can't just quote schools of thought and say, X and Y philosopher said this, so this is true. But I think hopefully what this will do is it will enable you to find additional reading and further reading that can help you along with conceptualizing the more deep-rooted issues concerning sex and gender. The second thing I'm going to try and cover throughout the 2 sections of discussion is a bit more on feminism in general, in terms of its ideology, what it stands for, but also in terms of its actual movement and what exactly it has done in terms of on the ground, the work on a community level, on a legal level, on a national level, what exactly feminism is, and like how different types of international feminism often interact with each other. And finally, I'm going to try and bring in a bit more on oppression and discussing the concepts of oppression and what exactly constitutes oppression, because ultimately the reality is we often talk of oppression as in some sort of physical force and coercion, but in reality oppression occurs in many, many different forms. It can come in physical violence, it can come in psychological pressure, and come in different forms of alienation. So oppression obviously doesn't just consist in physical violence, and I'm going to try and bring that into this workshop. So with that in mind, the structure has been laid out. So I'm now going to move on to talking about sex and gender on a more theoretical level, first of all, before moving on to what it actually is in reality in terms of real life examples and concrete images of sex and gender. So the first thing I think is important to recognize is that sex does not equate gender. So very often in colloquial terms or colloquial language, we often like to say, someone's sex is male and female because they look male and female, and obviously their gender is also male and female. We often use these terms interchangeably, but I think an important conceptual distinction is as follows. Sex very often describes the biological characteristics that you're born with. So the chromosomes, for instance, or the genes that define whom you are. And supposedly we often say your biological sex is predetermined before your birth. And that is why you might say, I have a masculine sex, or you have a feminine sex. But in reality, you're really just saying that this person is born with a biological characteristic of a man or a woman, or of course, there are other individuals that fall into neither of these categories due to biological differences, and they may choose to present themselves as either a man in real life or women, but in reality, they're also those that can choose as validly as always to present themselves as neither biologically male nor female. But over and all, sex is something that is generally considered as biological, as fixed, and you can undergo sex change operations, etc. And that obviously comes in the form of manipulating the characteristics of your sex, etc. But you can't cause a change in your chromosomes or genes, in so much as you can cause, as most people who undergo sex change operations do, a change in the genitalia and sexual characteristics, etc., etc. So for instance, if I undergo a sex change operation from being a male into a female, or being a man into women, I may undergo a removal of my penis and a creation of a vagina through the various alterations to the organs I have. But in general, in debating world, we often imagine sex as something that is quite fixed and plastic for a vast majority of people. And they often talk of it in terms of what they're born with or how people's biological characteristics after modifications in life end up as. That's sex. What is gender then? So gender is where it is really important to recognize that gender is about the social imagination of how I choose to present myself and how I choose to imagine and identify myself to the rest of the world out there. So for instance, you may say, when I ask you, what is your occupation? And you might go up there and say, I'm a student, I'm a teacher, I'm a professor. And if I ask you, for instance, what country do you come from, or what citizenship you hold, you might say, I come from China, I come from Finland, I come from Sweden, I come from England, etc. And I am an English citizen, etc. But very often you would notice that social constructs, these are what we call social constructs in the sense that they are constructed by how we interact with society, are a lot less fixed than what we consider as biological constructs, which is why I think it's important to emphasize that gender is a set of characteristics that you present yourself as voluntarily to the society around you. Which is why when it comes to gender, there are many, 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 many types of different genders. You may present yourself as male. You may present yourself as female. You may present yourself as transgender. You may present yourself as non-binary. You may think that these terms sound complicated, and in reality, I genuinely do think that everyone should try and learn the many types of genders and sexualities out there. But for the purpose of debating, I think the number one thing you have to clarify here is, at the very least, recognize that there are more types of genders than just the male gender, the female gender, and the transgender or non-binary gender, etc. There are many, many more types of different gender identities that people can subscribe to and choose to opt into. And I think it's important for you in debates to recognize that this is a legitimate choice, but that this gender or the feeling that you belong to a certain gender is indeed a choice or affected by biologically determined genes, that in itself is another debate. So that is why you may see motions coming up saying the LGBT movement should abandon the born that way or born this way label, because the born this way label is effectively saying you're genetically programmed to observe a certain set of gender characteristics, or you're genetically destined to present yourself as male or female, whilst the other school of thought, which is not biologically determined, argues that Gender is something that can be altered according to your conscious choice and your voluntary will. For the purpose of making a distinction between sex and gender, whilst it is important to recognize that perhaps genes or predetermined factors may affect your gender preferences, we generally think that gender is a lot more likely to be fluid and a lot more likely to be ambiguous when we talk about them, that there are a lot more gray areas when it comes to gender than sex. But the bottom line here is, when we're talking about sex and gender, we cannot obfuscate, or we should not try and confuse the two, because they very often mean two entirely different concepts to the people that have them. So for instance, I may see myself as sexually a male, but I'm also in gender or non-binary. And that is basically a distinction or separation between the two that we should be aware of. What does this lead to? This leads to basically the concept of gender as a construction. So construction obviously physically may mean that you're like building something and putting something together and assembling something. But when we talk about construction in sociological terms, so often meaning that construction happens because of the way we interact with society. So if we think of the ways that gender, or the concept of gender, or even the different characteristics of gender that we have come to know as male and female, thinking that some men should do things like, weightlift or do manual labor, or like women could only do household labor and stay at home and focus on taking care of children, which honestly is nonsense. All of this is nonsense. But I think a lot of these concepts of what gender roles are socialized concepts of what each gender ought to perform in society. So this is where we bring in the concept of socialization or social construction. When you're a child and you're brought up, going through education, going through schooling, etc., you are more likely than not to be exposed to very strong conceptions of what each gender is supposed to do. Fortunately, in Europe, especially in Scandinavia and also in England, such conceptions have largely died down since, as I'll mention later on, the rise of different waves of feminism that broke this sort of essentialism. But if you go to, say, Eastern societies or Oriental, say, Asian societies and countries, for instance, Hong Kong, where I come from, there's a significantly stronger sense that if you're born with a certain gender, so not sex, right, but gender, that your gender is fixed. So there's an assertion that your gender cannot be changed, and an assertion that your gender defines whom you are from the moment you are born. And that's often the assertion that comes through from societies where they're less, say, exposed or less receptive towards ideas of gender fluidity or the sex and gender dichotomy. So what therefore happens is construction happens in, I would say, 4 to 5 ways. Number one, the consumption of mass media. So entertainment, films, TVs, etc., fashion magazines, newspapers, that literally come up here and either positively affirm, saying, this is the ideal woman if she stays at home and does the household chore and submits to her husband and does everything she's supposed to do, versus, this is an ideal man, he's masculine, he works for his family, he's the breadwinner, he is powerful and rich. All of these gender norms are positively constructed in the sense that these are imagined as what is ideal, what is good. There's also what we call the subtle implicit socialization, where through mass media and television and entertainment, etc., they create scenarios where we feel that there's a difference between genders. So for instance, the constant trope of the damsel in distress, like having a woman being saved or protected by a very strong man in, say, nursery rhyme, or even in sort of the stories that you watch on Disney, like Snow White, like Rapunzel, like Sleeping Beauty, etc., where there's always a very strong and idolized man coming in to protect very weak and defenseless women. All of these scenarios are implicit passive reinforcements of gender norms, of gender types and gender tropes, of what they expect different genders to appear like and behave like. So women are always weak as imagined, and men are always the people that save the weak women in that instance. So this is mass media, the things that we consume actively on a social level for entertainment purposes, news, television, what have you, etc. Second way, parents. So just getting some water, sorry. So In terms of parents and childhood education, once again, I think in debates it's important to be nuanced and recognize that different households are liberal to conservative, rigid to fluid, and like relatively laissez-faire in a continuum. So some households might be very, very, liberal and completely avoid inculcating any gender norms in their children whatsoever. So parents might simply choose to actively tell their children, look, I don't believe you are my son or daughter, but you are my child, right? I don't believe that you belong to a particular gender. So that's on a very liberal far end of the household spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, in more conservative societies, for instance, or even in conservative communities within liberal countries, etc., there might still be a very strong gender essentialist view or a binary view conception of how children should act and react. That is why you would say that some parents might say, oh, I don't want to buy my son any pink toys or girly toys because he might become excessively girly. Or some parents refusing to let their daughters engage in things like hunting or physically strenuous activities because they think, oh, my daughter, obviously as a woman, she's going to grow up to marry to a husband and she's not supposed to do all sorts of things that would undermine her womanhood, etc. I personally, like interjecting here, think a lot of this is quite nonsensical. But obviously, the reality is that a lot of people have different thoughts and different conceptions. As parents and in family, especially in terms of nuclear families, they hold very, very strong grip over inculcating these gender norms and discussions about the differences or the alleged distinction between a man and a woman. So that the second way of socialization, which is to create this constructed image of what each gender is supposed to be, is via the family and via especially the parents. Third way, education. So this is where I think we need to also be a little bit careful, because education varies greatly, like significantly, from country to country. Some countries have schools that pursue state curricula that are very non-gendered, so gender neutral. They don't specify, oh, you are a girl, you should now go and only do, textiles or domestic work, and specialize in things like food technology, home economics, etc. And like that doesn't happen. But on the other end of the spectrum, you see education being used literally as an institution to reinforce male patriarchal superiority, where they literally say, I only admit men. Like, I think men are more superior and we're not going to admit any women. Or that even when they do admit women, they only restrict them to sort of denying them access to more advanced or more complex things that are deemed as inappropriate for a woman in the context of education. So these are two extremes, right? And very often schools lie in the middle, or like lie at some point on the spectrum. In liberal societies, you would say that most of them tend still towards like the explicitly more liberal end, but even then, there's still some certain schools that have very rigorous rituals, some all-male schools only, some schools that only admit a certain gender, like girls' school or boys' school, etc. So what we call single-sex schools or single-gender schools. In these instances, in liberal societies, we tend to believe that this sort of educational socialization is not as strong as it was 100 years ago. And we're very correct, largely, in believing this, because there obviously are other schools based in other countries where such forms of engendering the curriculum is still prevalent, where students are taught to literally worship, say, men icons. And in fact, a very interesting anecdote is in Hong Kong, when most female students were interviewed about what the idols or the figures that most inspired them from the science textbook that they studied in the past 6 years in his high school lives were, when graduating, they were asked that. And in Hong Kong, the survey turned out to reveal that over 90% of them basically quoted men. And the topping the list is Albert Einstein. So they basically said Albert Einstein's the most influential scientist there ever was. And a lot of that obviously came from the fact that in the actual curriculum about science, in the actual citation about science in science textbooks, the only women or female scientist that was ever quoted, ever, in Chinese textbooks in Hong Kong over the past 10 years is Madame Curie. And that is literally the only scientist that was ever quoted. So it is no wonder that education socializes people into seeing gender, but it also creates a very special form or specific form of genderization or socialization when it constructs an association of intelligence or superiority or knowledge with a particular gender in the status quo. So the concept of one gender, i.e. men, being more superior to women is largely reinforced by a lot of these tropes and characterizations that are put through in educational institutions. Fourth way of social construction is basically about the workplace or the workforce. And this is where the socialization effects manifest itself. Because remember that a lot of women from a very young age and a lot of men from a very young age are told that there are certain jobs they shouldn't do. So for instance, men are mocked in many instances, especially in more conservative cultures, for being nurses or for not becoming, you know, soldiers or doctors, or a very specific set of hyper-masculine employment jobs, that jobs that are deemed as suitable for men, that when they do things that are contrary to the expected gender roles, like being stay-at-home dads, like staying home and taking care of the children, etc., they're mocked. They're seen as, you know, pariahs in a society. And obviously it's a matter of scale. In Britain, this phenomenon, thankfully, is less strong. So there's less of this belief that all men have to be hyper-masculine, so super masculine. But in other societies, this sort of belief is still very prevalent. Similarly for women, if you've ever heard of the wage gap and also issues with pay disparity. Now, obviously, that's an entirely, you know, that's a can of worms, and I don't want to go into that too much detail. But effectively, you can argue that there's social pressures, even in the most liberal of all societies, that women should basically focus on doing either household chores or performing in very specific genres of occupations, like becoming teachers, like becoming nurses, like becoming cooks, like becoming the many occupations that men are also coincidentally alienated or like generally dissuaded from doing. But it's important to recognize that socialization and genderization of occupational roles tends to disproportionately affect women. So even if a man goes out there and picks up a job as a cook or picks up a job as a nurse, yes, he might get mocked, he might get laughed at in society, which is a horrible thing in itself. But it is a lot less arguably severe compared to women who try to undertake things like becoming a soldier, a military officer, CEOs, high-level executives, etc., but are instead repeatedly turned away and shut out through either implicit biases or simply people saying, look, we don't think this job is suitable for you. And at the interview stage, that is where a lot of the arbitrariness comes in, right? The arbitrary, implicit, subconscious biases. Having an interviewer who's very sexist and believes that women shouldn't go out into the workplace and all that. That is when you're more likely than not to have rejections and turn downs from the job market. And that is a problem in the status quo with socialization. And a final way through which socialization or the entrenchment of gender norms is created is actually through mass literature, the narratives, the words that we exchange between families and friends, the discourses. So this is where we talk a bit more about the concept of discourse and the way that words can be used to police actions. Because think about it, in a society where if I choose to put my name forward for a high-ranking job as a woman, and people know about this, the things that I hear, the things that they say and talk about me behind my back, like, I don't think she's qualified, or she's going to become a tokenistic CEO, etc. All of these words of skepticism are what we call discourses of oppression. They are discourses that are gendered inherently because they think that there's certain characteristics of women that make them innately unable or unsuitable for performing in high-level, high-functioning jobs. And more subtly, it's also about the way that gendered discourse is used to police female behavior in particular. If we look at a way that Hillary Clinton has been attacked, so Hillary Clinton, as in of course, she's in contention for the Democrats' candidates for the presidential elections this year for USA. Hillary Clinton has often been told off for several reasons. Number one, being told that she is too loud, that she's too aggressive as a woman. So this is what we call a form of tone policing, where the way that a woman says something becomes a subject of critique and attacks by society. And it very often manifests in very concrete impacts, because not every woman is like Hillary Clinton. And if you hear a man repeatedly saying, I think you're being too aggressive, you should speak softly, etc., and having their voices drown over you, these are very concrete, realistic experiences where less powerful women simply would therefore be silenced because they're so afraid of speaking and interacting with a society that enforces an expectation on the way they speak simply because of the gender. On a second level, though, Hillary Clinton was also, so if you watch the video of her being told or being mansplained. So what exactly does mansplaining mean? And mansplaining effectively means, and by the way, it's on Jimmy Kimmel, so it's a chat show based in the US. Mansplaining is effectively when a man, by the sheer nature of the asymmetry in gender, imposes and asserts his authority over women in explaining something to the women because he thinks that he knows about the topic or subject area better than the women. A lot of the ways through which gender norms reinforce itself is through the process of mansplaining, where basically the man, the masculine, dominates and hegemonizes, monopolizes discussion, and changes it effectively into a process where he can dismiss the women for not knowing as much or characterize the women as ignorant fundamentally. And all of these actions, the 5 things I talked about just then, number 1, mass media, number 2, parents, number 3, education, number 4, the job market, number 5, discourses in society, create the idea of 2 claims. They create the idea of the first claim being, there is a difference between male and female in terms of genderistic differences. The second claim they make is male, or in general, the masculine is preferable to the female, the feminine. So these are the 2 things that effectively sum up the contemporary socialization amongst many other things. And when you're talking about misogyny, therefore, when you're talking about gender and gender issues, therefore, it's important to think about it. What kinds of oppressions, what kind of discriminations, what kind of channels exist for this sort of binary to be imposed? How do they look like in real life? Because whilst it's very fair and square for you to go up there and in your speech say, look, there's some really important issues, right, in terms of a gender binary, and people are forced to subscribe to gender roles, etc. If you can give concrete examples, like in the 5 ways I talked about above, why these gender roles actually lead to harmful impacts, and that makes your speech a lot more persuasive and well substantiated. Cool. So the second part of my discussion here today is basically about the concept of marginalization and oppression. And by that, I mean, I want to outline a few of the groups that you might have heard of, or you might not have engaged with in specifically, so, with relation to the concept of oppression. So when we're talking about oppression, it is important to realize that in debates, when you often say X and Y are oppressed, it's a bit abstract. It's a bit difficult for me as a judge to get, what does oppression really mean? What does oppression actually lead to? And a lot of the areas I talked about just then already cover or hint at oppression in some form or another. But I want to briefly go over the marginalized groups that very often come up in debates, and I think is important in relation to sex and gender. This by no means is an exhaustive list. I must apologize in advance if I miss out any group that is marginalized in the status quo. And the very process of missing out a marginalized group and not talking about them actually has a term to it, erasure. So erasure is basically where you effectively pretend that a certain group's experiences of suffering or experiences groups of oppression and being denied, etc., are non-existent. So if I go up to you and say, look, I don't think you suffer any suffering because you belong to group Y, you're lying about your suffering. Or even very simply, when I'm writing about oppression and I deliberately miss you out, I'm erasing your oppression from the public discourse. And this is something that we can always talk about in debate, the concept of erasure of a certain minority. So if, for instance, when we're talking about LGBT, there's often a critique from the trans community that the LGBT community just doesn't represent the issues or the views whatsoever, that the views are simply not heard because there's no incentive for lesbians or gays or bisexuals, etc., to care about trans issues. And very often the dominant or powerful people within the movement are transphobic. CF Germaine Greer, who is a notable transphobic scholar based in Cambridge, and also Julie Bindel and various other members of the movement that have been accused of being transphobic. So transphobic as in actively disregarding the trans community, or basically saying that trans community doesn't really exist. So if you're interested, you might want to read Germaine Greer's recent comments and interviews regarding the whole issue of trans rights, etc. But I'm sidetracking, apologies. But so effectively, what exactly are marginalized groups that we ought to know right now? Number one, women. So it is important to realize that don't underestimate the fact that there are many debates where there are debaters that go up there and say misogyny doesn't exist at all, or women aren't oppressed, or women are now equal with men completely, 100%. There's no need to fight for equality anymore. A lot of this tends to be quite frustrating, but it's also useful for you to be able to pin down some concrete ways through which women are actively, suffering inequality. Number one, in terms of literal physical harms and violence in more conservative pockets of society. So even in London right now, certain radical Muslim communities would carry out what we call honor killings, where they kill daughters that have had sex with another man, or they kill rape victims, daughters who have been raped, or like women that have been assaulted before are killed as a part of the so-called honor and preserving their honor in accordance with the traditions. Now, I'm not saying that I believe Islam or any other religion is inherently misogynistic, although I do personally believe that there can be very strong arguments to say so. But we must note that there's certain manifestations of conservative practices, CF in religions or in other communities, that manifest in very traumatizing actions, physical actions directed towards women that current laws are not necessarily very competent at preventing or competent at stopping. But obviously, that's a very worst case scenario. Right? There are also other ways through which women are alienated in status quo. Two, in terms of access to rights and civil liberties, abortion rights are still an issue in Ireland and various other like Ireland in itself is a country where abortion is currently outlawed in some ways for women, and that is why a lot of women seeking abortion have to travel all the way to the UK with a hope of getting some sort of abortion here instead of in Ireland. Similarly, in more conservative countries, abortion is outlawed in many areas, and in fact, even in America, abortion was only legalized over the past 50 years, and that was done gradually state by state. And there's still currently a lot of battle over the time and limits to which abortion is able to be pursued. So there are time limits on the number of terms that after which you're not allowed to kill your own embryo. And this is still the case in many states around the US. And not only that, but also in terms of civil liberties of being able to have your economic rights enshrined, or being able to be sent to schools and enjoy the same quality of education. Even in the most advanced of all democracies, even in the most developed of all democracies we talk about, there's still very great disparity amongst or between men and women in terms of education or the opportunities they have in engaging and interacting with education, because of the previously discussed norms that men should study, women should stay home. And this is even more so the case in, say, countries that are not very progressive or don't have a very progressive society or progressive legislature. In reality, substantive freedoms of women are still limited in many ways because they're unable to access the education opportunities when they're young, the job opportunities when they graduate, and also the other clauses that can protect their freedom, especially in terms of the public health. So maternal care, personal vaginal health, etc. All sorts of issues are still being fought over. For reference, for instance, in the UK, there's still a tax on tampons, where basically you have to pay a certain sum of money in order, or additional sum of money, because tampon is not considered as a luxury. It's considered as a luxury as opposed to a necessity. And the funniest thing is, obviously, the UK legislature believes that the pita bread is a necessity and therefore isn't taxed, but tampons are taxed. The razor blades, or the blades that men use to shave, are not taxed, but the tampon taxes are there and are still existent. And these things are embodiments of what we call systemic structural inequalities in terms of the commodities and goods women can access, in terms of how much they have to actively pay. All sorts of inequalities still manifest. Final ways which misogyny happens is largely in terms of the psychology. So one of the most interesting phenomena that is very interesting to talk about in the context of affirmative action debates, or debates about having women in high levels as CEOs, is the concept of imposter syndrome, which is effectively where a lot of high-performing women at very high levels, like executives, leaders of departments, chief executives, what have you, fear that their successes and fear their so-called achievements are merely the result or merely the outcome of being lucky or being blessed by some unrelated factor, or factor unrelated as skill. And this is what we call the imposter syndrome, the feeling that you're an imposter and you're ultimately someone who's not good enough for the job or qualified enough for the job. So why is this harmful? It's harmful because it dissuades women from applying to lots of things. Like, that is why women are less likely to apply for, say, Oxbridge compared to men, especially in socioeconomically deprived backgrounds or disadvantaged backgrounds. There's often a lot lower application rate in general. And this sort of phenomenon happens because there's certain expectations and norms, as A4 established, that police the actions of women and the things that they do in a society. So to recap the three ways which misogyny or this sort of alienation of women happen in the status quo is: 1, the physical; 2, the social; and 3, the economic and psychological. Now on to the second, the marginalized groups, which is basically lesbians and gays. So I'm dividing this into various chunks. Lesbians and gays, in the sense that both of them are homosexuals, but it's also important to recognize that there are issues faced uniquely by gay men versus lesbian women. And it's also important to be able to talk about them not as a single entity, even though we often like to group them as homosexuals. Hold on a second, wait. Sorry, my audio is currently, my laptop is dying, so I'm just gonna run 1 minute to get a charger. Hold on a second, apologies. Why is it stop? Oh, crumbs. Where's my charger? Charger. Apologies, I will be right back in 2 minutes time looking for my charger. Okay, I'm back. Hi, sorry about that. Okay, sorry. So my charger disappeared for a while. That being said, so when we're talking about lesbians and gays, it's also important to recognize that, for instance, homosexuals previously, and especially male homosexuals, so gays in that sense, were involved in a lot of active stigmatization and forms of stigmatization that frame them as very lascivious and sexually permissive individuals. And this applies particularly to gay men, because during the time, for instance, of the US President Ronald Reagan, under his active governance and alleged advocacy, he created an allegation that basically gay men are mostly HIV positive, or rather all, or if not the majority of HIV patients are basically gay. And that sort of stigmatization applies especially to gay men because of the way that sexual intercourse is carried out in that sense. And that is why the labeling effect of them being HIV positive, sexually promiscuous, lascivious men that are fallouts from society was particularly prevalent, and is still very prevalent in even democracies or advanced democracies. And they also face, of course, in less advanced democracies or in relatively culturally conservative countries, an additional stigma, which is they fail to conform to the traditional expectation as men you're supposed to like a woman and fall in love with a woman and continue your family name or family tradition by having children with your woman. And that applies, for instance, to how gay homosexuals are perceived in China and Hong Kong today, that they are failing an important rite of ritual that every man is supposed to do. And notice here, there's once again an equivalence of sex and gender, which is if you're born like a man, you're expected to conform to a male standard or a masculine standard or what is expected of you. So there's also the additional stigma there. And finally, in terms of how gay men in particular suffer from issues related to hypermasculinity, so there's often this image in mass media that all gay men are very feminine, and they appear very feminine and soft and all sorts of non-masculine characteristics when they display themselves or pursue activities that are seen as very girly or non-masculine, for instance, like sewing or textiles, etc., i.e. camp. The biggest misconception this is, right, because this is a complete misconception of how gay homosexuality actually manifests, because gay homosexuality does not determine whether or not you display very, very strongly masculine traits or very, very feminine traits, and or traits associated typically with femininity. Because in reality, homosexuals can span a vast range of different characteristics. Like gay men can display a vast range of different characteristics, from being relatively effeminate to hypermasculine and being very, strong bodybuilders, etc. All types within these can be gay. There's no reason why someone who's very who carries out activities traditionally associated with strong men, like becoming a military officer or being a personal gym coach, etc., cannot also be gay. So that's a misconception that needs to be clarified. But what does this mean in debating terms? It's important for you to, therefore, in debating terms, to recognize that as a homosexual, that doesn't mean that you are normalized or socialized into performing only one type of occupation, which is like effeminate jobs, or displaying one type of behaviors, i.e. effeminate behaviors. It's important to say that if you, as a strong and masculine homosexual gay, are being alienated by narratives that basically carry out erasure upon you, then there's an importance in us to enshrine and protect the rights of gay homosexuals that do not necessarily identify themselves with the effeminate orthodox other that's been imagined by the popular consciousness. In terms of lesbianism and the concept of when we talk about lesbian couples or lesbian homosexuality, it is very important to recognize that lesbian feminism is also an important cultural perspective and a critical perspective that should be considered. So it's basically a conjunction of lesbian rights and also female rights. And you might be particularly interested in several authors I'd recommend, for instance, Charlotte Bunch and also Cheryl Clark. So what effectively lesbian-specific problems or lesbian-specific demands are is that they once again face a concept that they do not fall very well or do not meet very well into a conception of relationship or intergender relationship where a woman can only date a man and a man can only date a woman. They don't fall into this hetero conception of relations. And that is why very often there's also misconception that lesbianism is merely a natural part of all women in general, that says, lesbianism is just women experimenting, and in reality there's no such thing as being lesbian, it's just that these women haven't found men yet. Like, this sort of generalizations and these sorts of claims about lesbianism being a misconception or a misguided concept is also harmful, because it reaffirms a lot of the gender tropes about women being driven by emotions or driven by passion and not really able to make rational decisions by themselves. So notice the linkage here about the erasure of lesbianism and a linkage between that erasure with classical feminine, like feminized tropes or gendered tropes and misconceptions about women. So it's important to see the linkages there as well. So that's basically the homosexual group as well. The third group that I think is important to recognize is the bisexual group. And the bisexual group is another group that's often experienced a lot of tensions with the mainstream of LGBT movements, because these are the very people that even a lot of homosexuals or homosexual campaigning activists, etc., often say, look, these people here are basically cheaters. They're trying to cheat the system because they, at the very same time, they can pass as heterosexual by dating someone of the opposite sex, but at the very same time, they also claim to be an ally or claim to have homosexual tendencies. So there's an animosity and tension within the LGBT movement that basically people think the bisexuals are pretenders. They are only pretending to have homosexual experiences, but in reality, they don't really know what it is like to be a sexual other or sexual homosexual, because they can just fall back allegedly, that is, emphasis on allegedly, on dating another partner of the opposite sex, so therefore circumvent all the problems allegedly because of the bisexuality. This is what we call bi-erasure. So bi-erasure occurs in the sense that people who are bi or people who are bisexual are told either of two things. One, they're just being sexually experimenting and promiscuous. So once again, bisexuality is just a phase and all that. So that is one way of people like attacking bisexuals, by saying, oh, you're just going through a phase, it's going to pass sometime soon, you're not really bisexual. So that's a denial of the bisexuality. Another type is the animosity held by certain activists, even, that bisexuality is unfair, it's not justified, it's not really, what the whole concept of the LGBT movement is actually supposed to do that, because these people can pass as heterosexual and therefore not experience any oppression in reality. The clarification that's important to say here is, one, a lot of people are still alienated and excluded because they are bisexuals, and even more so because people think that they flip-flop and fluctuate. They're also framed in particular as lascivious, as decadent with no moral standard. But second of all, they face oppression in that their identity being denied collectively by a consciousness, by people that even claim to be allies, etc. This active denial of their identity is experienced ever more greatly for bisexual. This sense of narratives of exclusion that say what you believe in or what you self-identify as is non-legitimate. It's not legitimate because it doesn't exist, that it isn't real. So being told that what you believe in and your orientation isn't real, this is an exclusively unique oppression that particularly affects the bisexual group. And this is what we call the bi-erasure processes of oppression. Fourth category then, talking about trans. So trans is a very, very sorry, I lost connection there. Okay, connection back. Right. So trans erasure or trans denial is once again a form of exclusion that is practiced by even certain members within the LGBT movement. CF Germaine Greer. So Germaine Greer, as I mentioned earlier on, is a radical feminist, and she believes that there's no such thing as trans people, or at the very least she thinks that trans people, especially men who later on undergo sex change operations or operations to alter their presenting gender to female, etc., because they feel that their gender should be female and feel that their sex should be female, etc. Germaine Greer often makes speech that says, it's just men trying to cheat the system. It's just men pretending to be women, etc., to gain sympathy and all that. And similarly, women who actually feel that they are men and therefore undergo operations to become trans men, or may not undergo operations but present themselves as men. Germaine Greer and various other transphobic elements within movements also say that they are taking an easy way out of escaping feminism and the burdens of femininity. Now, I personally disagree strongly with Germaine Greer, but I think it's important for everyone to have a good look at her work and try and understand where she's coming from. Because Germaine Greer's theory is, in this aspect, quite wrong, but it's also founded upon her conception of gender essentialism. So she doesn't quite buy the whole sex and gender dichotomy, and that is what underpins a lot of her description concerning why she thinks that trans individuals don't really exist or not legitimately trans, etc. But trans, apart from that, also face real practical harms, like number one, not being able to utilize bathrooms, or being forced to go to a particular bathroom. If you've been following American news, you'll recognize that there's been a sort of massive Republican generated scandal over trans bathrooms, and having bathrooms where trans can simply go into and not necessarily be told that they're not in the right place, or be denied access because they belong to allegedly the wrong gender. That these sort of issues of access, right? But there are also issues concerning access to the actual operations themselves, because it's pretty damn costly in a lot of American states, in developing countries in particular, for people to undergo safe operations that don't end up with long-term repercussions, and for them to undergo hygienic operations that can enable them to shift their characteristics to match what they believe is a genuine gender in that sentence, is very often not something that everyone can access. It's a privilege, it's a luxury that a lot of people can only access if they pay copious amounts of money, especially in countries that don't currently have publicly funded healthcare. It's really difficult for them to be able to achieve the purposes that we talked about just then. What this therefore means is that trans individuals, as with gays, as with lesbians, as with bisexuals, etc., face a lot of practical harms, but these are concrete examples of practical harms that you should bring in when you're talking about debates concerning LGBT rights and oppression of them in general. Then there's also, obviously, other types of gender identities, or sexual orientations. So in terms of sexual orientations, there can be pansexuals and asexuals. Pansexuals are effectively individuals that do not necessarily, or are not necessarily only sexually attractive to sorry, lost connection just then again for some very bizarre reason. So pansexual individuals, or we might call it omnisexuality, is a form of sexual attraction and romantic love towards people of any sex and any gender identity. So for them, what the sex and gender of the people that they fall in love with does not matter. And very often pansexual people may refer themselves as gender blind, that they don't really care about gender, and gender and sex are insignificant or irrelevant in terms of determining their basis for sexual attraction. And in terms of the asexuality, which is a bit of a flip side, asexuality is effectively the lack of sexual attraction to anyone, or completely low or very, very low levels of interest or desire in sexual activity or having sexual partners in general. Why do we talk about these groups? Because very often when we talk about mainstream LGBT discourses, or as an individual who's not really engaged that much in discussions about gender and sex, we often neglect these groups and pretend or imagine that there are only that many minorities out there that we ought to talk about. But at the very same time, we therefore erase them from our consciousness and erase them from the agenda of protection. That is obviously very important as well. Finally, in terms of gender identities, they are also individuals that do not feel they belong to the binary sexual classification. So genderqueer individuals, also termed as say non-binary / gender expansive, is effectively a bit of a blanket label for gender identities that do not fall exclusively into the masculine gender or the feminine gender. So effectively individuals that fall outside the gender binary and a very normative system of classifying people's gender. You may see yourself as having two or more genders, say bigender or trigender. You may see yourself as having no gender at all, so agendered or non-gendered. Or you might also see yourself as gender fluid, in the sense that fundamentally you move or shift between one gender to another. So you might be asking yourself at this point, why should I care? Like, why is this important? So, like, not only from the point of view that it's quite important to know about this from a social awareness point of view, it's also about the very fact that in most debates, when you're asked to talk about gender binarism, so what I talked about just then, the concept that society only has a male and a female gender, that these are the very people that do not fall within this classification system. These are the people that the current system goes up to them and says, look, we don't recognize you, you're wrong, you don't exist, we don't care about you, you don't care about how you think of yourself. And these are the very people that currently fall outside the catchment area of the mainstream discussion concerning gender, which is still largely locked in binaristic terms. So when you're talking about debates on whether or not we should have gender roles or gender binaries, it's also good for you to be able to bring in awareness of people that don't fall as either feminine nor masculine, but instead fall outside the current description or the descripting spectrum, etc. So that is effectively the number of groups or the main minorities within the spectrum of sex and gender. I think we could talk about. There are loads more that we can explore, and I think like demisexuality, or even in cases of queer heterosexuality or a third gender or the possibility of being trigender, all of these possibilities exist, and I definitely think we should all read up on it and definitely try and cover them in terms of argumentation later on if I can in a workshop. But if not, I genuinely recommend that you check them out and try and look them up for various sources and texts. And I think a very good site for me to start, or I often start with, is actually, I will type this and send it to you. Okay, so basically the sites I found as very useful in terms of general introductions or general discussions concerning what we call queer theory is a website called www.theory.com. So it's a site about critical theory, but it often has very interesting stuff about nuances in gender or nuances in discussions concerning sex and gender as well. And a second website that I strongly recommend is basically QZ, so Quartz, QUARTZ. It's a very good platform for not just things related to sex and gender and queer studies, but also for lots of articles apart from that. I genuinely think it's a good website for everyone who has an interest in the area to check out for more contemporary and recent developments in theory, etc. And of course, there are academic journals that you can check out online, and I definitely think it's important for you to do so as well. So I will now spend around 15 minutes or so talking about the final chunk of my discussions, which is from a social movements point of view, about what exactly are the social movements in the LGBT movement, etc. What exactly are the issues that you might come across? What exactly are the characterizations you might come across in debates and in real life, so outside debating? I'm going to spend around 50 minutes or so before going on to Q&A section with everyone. But finally, and this is the third chunk of today, what exactly do movements do? And what exactly are the points of having movements, etc.? So very often we see an argument say, movements send a message. So they send a message about there being a problem, or they send a message that people right now are not doing well, or they send a message about the importance of rights, etc. But I actually think that when we're talking about or trying to impact social movements, we need a lot more nuance than just talking about sending messages or how they affect public discussions or whatsoever. So 5 ways I think we can talk about movements in general that applies to almost all debates, but in particular in terms of mobilization for queer movements or the LGBT movements. Number 1, political advocacy. So political advocacy comes in many levels. Legislatively, in terms of voting decisions, what we call vote bundling or bargaining. So saying like, as a bloc, as a pack, I will pay X and Y candidate for you to run, and I'll endorse these candidates to run in certain local elections, in state elections. I'm talking in an American context here. Or in a non-American context, you might be talking about endorsing candidates, about, having people to literally distribute leaflets for a candidate you believe is good for the cause. Political advocacy comes in that form, in a sense that it might be a form of political mobilization to put in people that you think, getting some water, putting in people that you think would be useful towards the cause and voting for them, sending them into legislators, parliaments, etc. But on a second level, it's about lobbying. So obviously not, unfortunately, every candidate endorsed by movements can go in, but very often movements and the leadership structure, especially the mid-tier and the high tiers, advocates within the structure and also arguably the leader, they often go up to political representatives from the executive and talk to them and lobby to them, directly expressing their concerns and basically saying, look, there are certain problems in terms of economic issues, in terms of discrimination, that my fellow minority sexuality is suffering in the status quo. What is particularly important here is to recognize that LGBT movements in developed societies or developed countries, versus developing countries have two very different sets of objectives that overlap but also diverge. Developed countries tend to be those where civil liberties and social liberties tend to be enshrined for most LGBT individuals. So these are cases where you probably won't see, thankfully, cases where people are beaten up on the streets, physically abused, attacked on a mass scale. So you won't see that, hopefully, appearing because there's some law and discipline and order. It's a high-functioning state. The police is decent. People aren't violently lynched repeatedly again and again. People have some access to basic civil liberties. They can vote. But obviously, discrimination here, or the mobilization issue, or the issue on which mobilization occurs, is therefore largely to do with access to things like more liberties, like trans healthcare, trans operations, or protection in terms of HIV, or ending the stigmatization of homosexuals for their sexual behaviors, being sex positive homosexuality, or embracing sex positive queerness, and being frank and open about it, about gaining social acceptance. And even in the case of last year, 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges, right, the idea of having homosexual marriage legalized in America. These are unique sets of agenda items that apply more to those in the developed world. In developing countries, we very often see what we talked about just then, a lot of them, the ideological stuff or the social stuff, being put to the back because there are more pressing issues, like literally how to ensure that you won't get stoned and killed and murdered by an angry mob on the street. So like, that is why a lot of the vibrant LGBT communities, and even countries like Russia, in Iran, and China, etc., are literally fighting against state oppressive structures, against violence perpetrated by vigilante mobs, etc. And all of these cases are situations where fundamentally these movements have the same methods also, but they achieve very different ends and goals to that effect. So that's the first part. We're talking about political advocacy. Second part is actual on-the-ground support, so groundwork, what we call providing the network support to individuals on the ground. And this is very often the issue and the case as with healthcare services, where especially in rural countryside regions, where even in most developed countries, rural countryside very often don't have extensively detailed healthcare plans or like extensively detailed access to protection and healthcare. So what social movements or local units of the movements on a grassroots level do is they provide you with the support networks that come to you, first responders that come up to you and protect you and sort of try and engage you in psychological support when you have been assaulted, discriminated against, or abused as a result of your sexual identity, or etc. And noting that these individuals are particularly vulnerable, social movements also therefore serve as a therapeutic element where people come up here and try and help you in cases of unfortunate crises occurring. Third element, shifting and shaping the public consciousness through active presence. So recognize that when we talk about things and converse about different social issues, we often make references to things that we see in society or make references to things that we observe on the streets. If I'm living in a community where I literally do not know that there's such a thing called lesbianism or homosexuality, or I still think of it in a very regressive way, where I say, oh, this is like, the devil come again. This is obviously the end of the world if homosexuality ever does happen. I very often cannot imagine in this society, I cannot understand the reasons for which anyone would want to be homosexual. So what the role of these movements are actively about, beyond sending out messages, it's about communicating and conversing, creating dialogue and engendering discussions that try and convert people that are convertible. So obviously, you're unlikely to convert people from the Westboro Baptist Church, but you're more likely than not to be incentivized to convert those that you think you can convert ultimately. So reaching out to those people on the ground that you believe can be persuaded and convincing them to join you as an ally, or ultimately just convincing them to not being so antagonistic and destructively violent towards your cause. A lot of this groundwork mobilization also comes through. Fourth, in terms of producing discourse and producing theories and concepts that not only go into public consciousness in terms of influencing people's opinions, but also creating systematic schools of identities that you can identify with. Because very often when you feel that you're genderqueer, or which is a very large and broad umbrella term, you don't really necessarily know what type of gender identity or what type of specific identity you are. So what the role of movements often is about, it's about organizing the consciousness and organizing in a way that allows you to happily opt into and identify, this is what I feel like the most. You find yourself through engaging as part of the community with the discussions and generation processes of your identity, and through talking to other people who shared your lived experiences within the movements, having this community of support and rapid, connected and formed through, say, Facebook, or even real life neighborhoods, or even on a state level where you regularly meet, say, once a week or twice a month or something. These sort of support networks are very important in helping you maintain and sustain a healthy identity and self-conception. So there's a psychological benefit that comes along with this discursive production process. Final thing why social movements tend to be quite useful in terms of impacts is the ability to deliver immediate, concrete outcomes when discrimination occurs. So when employment, or when employers literally don't hire you, these are the movements or the organizations that give you the money to go to legal aid, or give you the money to have legal counsel and representation, and sue your employers for discrimination. And these are also the people that give you the legal advice and support that you otherwise would not have in institutions that currently work against you. So a lot of these organizations are very useful for all the reasons outlined above, not just because they send out a message, but because they do a lot of the things I talked about just then, beyond, just sending out a interesting idea or making it be known. So there are lots more nuance when you talk about movements that I hope you can incorporate, not just about, movements being a good symbolic value or symbolically good thing, but actually in reality they do lots of good things beyond the symbolic value, and that's important to clarify in most debates. Right now I think we'll have a 2-minute break. I'm just going to refill my water bottle and we'll come back for some Q&A if that's okay with everyone. Awesome. Hi everyone. Okay, so I'm back. Right. Basically, the Q&A section will go on for effectively as long as you want it to be. And if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them through. If you can type it in the YouTube section where I'm currently posting the links, that would be useful. And I'll try and answer them one by one. Great. Yeah, you can definitely ask questions here. No worries, guys. Take your time. I'll keep waiting. No worries. Okay. So, for the benefit of everyone, yep. So, okay. So there's a question from me about in debates about gender, sometimes motions can have even more drastic consequences for transgender and non-binary individuals, etc., than the most commonly discussed cis and binary stakeholders. How often would you recommend bringing these up in debates that focus on cis and binary gender, or the motion having particularly focused on them? And when you do, how do you impact them? Given how common erasure is and how cis and binary is by definition a larger group, I find that these can be hard to impact. So that's the question I was asked. So they're effectively two questions, right? First of all, should we bring up in debates that are not explicitly about non-binary, non-cis individuals, the arguments about individuals of that sort in debates that are explicitly about, say, binary and cisgender? And second of all, how does impacting happen? So in answering the first question, I think I have several rules of thumb. So a caveat before I start is there's often a trend increasingly towards using an argument about non-binary or non-cis actors in every motion possible related to sexuality in general. I think that is wrong. I don't think that is a fair way of doing things. I think that also probably makes your adjudicators quite exasperated. So I think a useful rule of thumb number one is a question: what actually changes, right? Because very often there's an argument that tries to say, okay, say for instance, this house would cast the next James Bond as a woman, or as a bisexual of that sort, or as, I would take it from Manchester Ivy, for instance. This house would cast the next James Bond as having had sexual experiences with men, or words to that effect. I'm very bad with memorizing it accurately. Sorry about that. But for that motion, for instance, we were CO and I ran a case I would later regret, and I think is honestly not a very good case, which was basically a discussion concerning bi-erasure. So we argue that if you allow this motion to happen, you therefore create an erasure of bi-individuals. But in that case, this is actually not a good usage of it, because it's a marginal impact that would occur on either side anyway, right? It doesn't mean that because of this motion, then this impact happens, because this impact will occur regardless of whether or not this sort of casting decision is made in general. So this whole thing about erasure, or arguments about bi in that sense, was probably not a very wise tactic. But in debates where you are doing things that you think is an actively erasing thing, for instance, saying, this house believes that the LGBT movements, which, by the way, there is no one single movement, so I often quite dislike people saying there's only one movement, but like, this house believes LGBT movements, like a plurality of them, should rename themselves to, or should prioritize excessively homosexual issues over non-homosexual issues. That is a valid debate where you have to, obviously, in accordance with the motion, do two things. Number one, bring in cis or non-binary discussions concerning the minority groups that are often erased and ignored. And second of all, weighing. So you have to weigh it up and say, look, we need to care about these other groups more importantly, or they matter more than prioritizing exclusively homosexuality or the needs of homosexuals because of X, Y, and Z reasons. So that is why I think it is important to bring up arguments when you think there's an actual impact in that sense. The second rule of thumb I suggest is, how exclusive is it? How specific is the argument, right? Because any motion about the movement in general, so like as with a classic cliched opposition case, which is, oh, this leads to more fragmentation, or this causes people to argue and bicker amongst themselves and there'll be fragmentation, is this argument works almost on every single motion about movements in general, just like backlash arguments with like governmental policies, right? You have to ask yourself, what makes this erasure of the minorities so important and so relevant? Is it exclusively related to what happens because of the motion, or is it just, you know, a general thing that happens anyway, that erasure occurs because the movement in itself structurally is unreceptive towards a minority within the movement? Like, why? So you have to ask yourself, am I talking about the motion, or am I just talking about a problem that's unrelated in reality to the motion? So that's the second rule of thumb. Final rule of thumb is, what type of impact are you talking about? If you're just talking about making a few individuals feel bad, but like a few, say, non-cis individuals feel emotionally not very happy, which obviously is a bad thing, right, in reality. But at the same time, you gain things like, you protect, say, homosexuals from a particular country from being attacked or assaulted. Like, you protect and prevent grave physical harm. In that case, obviously, you would say, maybe it's not as impactful, maybe it's not as important, so you don't try and bring that in as a point. How do you impact them? So I think impacting in any motion about social movements must be about reality. You can't just say, oh, that means that in some vaguely abstract conceptual terms, there'll be less people voting on issues like this. You have to A, explain why that's true, but B, give me the impact. So number one, how does this change the way healthcare is organized, right? Second of all, how does this change the way education is provided? And like, where not the school quality or schools admit individuals of such sexualities, like Harvey Milk schools, are they good or bad things? What impact does this have on children or sexually unsure, undecided individuals? Third impact, for instance, economic opportunities, employment, are they going to get hired or not? Fourth of all, in terms of psychological welfare, what are they likely to do? Are they going to internalize narratives of harm? And very often, especially in cases like Harvey Milk schools, the impact that you want to focus on is ultimately things like individuals might feel on a very micro level. You might say, okay, judge, I know, like adjudicators, panel, I know this doesn't sound very important, but from a point of view of someone who's queer, this means everything to them, to not have someone, or to have someone coming in here to say, look, we think we should accept whom you are, as opposed to being surrounded by negative comments that make them feel devalued as a human and almost driven to the verge of like carrying out things that are harmful to themselves, etc., self-harm. So I think the impacts need to be concrete, they need to be real, they need to be felt. Because as an adjudicator, when I listen to your speech, I want to hear what really is going on, what is actually happening, as opposed to just more abstract and conceptual discussions about, you have fewer rights, or they have the rights taken away and that's not good. I want to know where and how are these rights actively taken away, and why exactly is this something I should actually care about in relation to the motion. Okay, so another question on YouTube that I saw is, what do you think about essentialist argumentation, or argumentation based on essentialist premises? So, sorry if I'm butchering your name. Valtteri, you seem to be saying, I presume that you're asking about argumentation that basically asserts, okay, all women do this and all men do that. All men should do this and all men should do Y, etc., etc. Two things. So the two levels, right? The first argumentation level is a factual one. It's a positivist one where you say all men are X, all women are Y, or like all homosexuals are Z. That, in 99% of all cases, is just unpersuasive. It's unpersuasive in the sense that it's not real, not really nuanced, and in reality, obviously, no one is the same, right? Like, no one is 100%. No 100% of certain populations share the characteristic beyond the characteristic that defines them. So, like, yes, all cows are cows, but that doesn't mean that all cows have 4 legs, because some of them have 3 legs. Similarly, you can say all men are men and all women are women, but beyond that, I don't think any generalizations, like beyond saying, like, or assertions saying all men are X and all men are Y, should be produced. There's some trickier cases where you can say most men are X, most women are Y, and I think these are okay in certain instances. For instance, in discussing oppression, so saying most women right now face active oppression in some form or another that is concretely felt, and all women in some form or another are victims of structured patriarchy or oppression in society. I think that sort of generalization is okay, but you have to substantiate it, because otherwise it just becomes an assertion. And very often in a liberal sphere of debating, we like to say, oh, this is definitely true, but I also think it's important to concretize and let people know, why is it true that, like, what are the examples of all women, or like a vast majority of women being oppressed? What are the instances? Like, then you can talk about the economic instances, physical instances, cultural, conceptual instances, etc. that I mentioned earlier on, and that's where you concretize things, okay? I think in that sense, though, essentialization is acceptable, but you're not really essentializing here. You're making a generalization as opposed to essentialization. Second part, the normative side. So this is where it becomes very tricky, and I would like to give you a general rule of thumb. A general rule of thumb that you just shouldn't essentialize duties, and you shouldn't essentialize what people should do. You shouldn't be like, oh, all men, because they're men, should therefore go to the army and become a soldier, or all women, because they're all women, and they are just women indeed, should remain home and be housewives. That is awful, and that's also, by the way, entrenching gender norms. But if you're using this in a different way, so not in an essentializing way, but saying in a generalized way, all men generally have a universal duty to prevent and undo the harm that's enriched them, but has also deprived women and historical generations of women of access to opportunities. So the general obligation point about why men in general should try and fight misogyny comes in 2 levels. Number one, a duty to prevent harm, which is like, if harm is literally incurred in women because of male action, they have to stop it because they're directly responsible and they're also causing harm. Second level, more specifically, which is the idea that they've benefited from it. Like, if I've benefited from actively harming you, or like by passively being complicit with a harm towards you, then that's also an awful thing. So this is how you can generalize a duty on men in general. But in most cases, I just believe that the argument that there are fundamental, essential differences between men and women are ultimately unpersuasive. Unless you can make a claim that is explained and grounded in things beyond, oh, we obviously think that men and women should do X and Y because they just are, unless you can offer a persuasive reason why I should accept that, in addition to like the fact of them being merely different in terms of the gender, I tend to say that most essentialistic arguments or essentialist arguments are unpersuasive in debates. And I think that's very important to remember when you're engaging in competitive debating as well. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry, did not see the events thread. Okay, I can now see the thread. Sorry about that. So Marcus asked me, how would you recommend framing your arguments when you find yourself on a conservative side of the argument? Okay. So, very often there are two types of motions. One type of motion is literally one where you think it is asking for you to defend conservative claims, but in fact, you might be asked to defend another progressive or an even more progressive position in general. What is the instance here? So, for instance, this house would abolish all marriage, or this house would not grant the right to marry to anyone. Superficially, it seems like at first glance that you think, oh, is this to do with gay marriage or things of that sort? But in reality, no, because as you're not propping anything conservative at all. You're literally talking about abolishing marriage for everyone. So this is not about not having gay marriage. This is saying that marriage as an institution structurally is wrong. So this is where you may think you need to do conservative work, but actually you're not arguing for conservative stance. You're just trying to talk about the idea of progressivism or tackling it from another route by saying that there's a more progressive solution. The second case is where the motion is ambiguous, where in reality it can be interpreted in both a conservative or a progressive way. So it might be this house would this house would reduce the tax on tampons, or this house would establish a tax that charges men, or this house would establish this house would establish affirmative action in sphere X, Y, and Z for women. So when you're tackling this motion, one way of doing it is to argue against affirmative action. And the other way of tackling it is just basically counterplot a more radical solution, like basically you don't have affirmative action or some sort. I tend to avoid the second type because I think it's a bit cheaty and I don't think it's really in spirit of motion, but that might come in sometime. But even when you're talking about defending against affirmative action, you think you're being conservative, but actually you're just being asked to find ways through which you actually harm people through affirmative action. For instance, the idea of having imposter syndrome, of like creating antagonistic discourses and like relations. Third of all, in undermining the achievements of people in general. And fourth of all, in sapping away the ability to focus on more fundamental issues, like the classic political capital argument. I don't think that's a great argument. I think it can be put in nonetheless. So in reality, notice how you superficially think, oh, opposing affirmative action makes me conservative. But actually, no, in reality, and say they are ways in which affirmative action harms the people we want to protect here. And this debate is about finding the best way to protect them in the long term, fundamentally, not about what in the short term resolves things like a gap in enrollment rates, etc., etc. So that is where what we call a superficially conservative but actually progressive position. Finally, in the third subcase, which is the motion is probably expecting you to actually defend conservative positions. So by conservative, you mean libertarian, laissez-faire, non-interventionist state, small state. So this is where I think it's important to do two things. Number one, prove an impact on your side. That is an exclusive harm on their side, and that your side is either not as bad or in fact brings you benefit in. And the second part of this, and a key part of this, is weighing. So in your framing of the issue, you literally come up here and LO and say, like, look, if the motion, like if OT is progressive and you're OO and you're quite like conservative in that sense, or you're forced to be conservative in reality, you say, right, this is a debate about trade-off, okay, between X and Y. So X is about having this sort of change in more equality. Y is about the overall obligation of state not to intervene in private affairs regardless because of the structural flaws and structural harms in the state. Say this at LO, like if we can show to you that we outweigh, like the harms you incur outweigh the benefits and we bring you a better world, we win this debate. So literally say, this is a debate about weighing and I'm going to weigh this for you to win this debate. And then give the weighing. So you need to weigh it up very carefully, not just in saying, look, these are conservative values, yours are progressive values, we win because we're more conservative, haha. But actually say, look, number one, your benefits may not necessarily happen, but our harms definitely will materialize and are really bad. Second of all, the people that you harm aren't really the the people that you benefit aren't really the people that really need help. In fact, we say on our side, we benefit the people who really need more help than the people who need help on your side. Do the weighing up. And after the weighing, the two parts of the argument should come together to prove your conservative case as beating the progressive case. But I argue that, and I genuinely think that in 90% of cases, there's no genuine conservative position that you need to take to win a debate. The only 10% there is where you have to give principle justification and make sure that there's a strong value trade-off that you can defend and show why your side is more important than the other. So weighing is important, right, in general, but weighing is particularly important when it comes to defending authentically conservative positions. Yeah. Okay. Next question. Scrolling down. Okay. What do you think are the strong prop and op arguments for these two motions, respectively? This house would make the next James Bond a female, and this house would make James Bond's next love interest a male. Let's talk about the first one, right? So, effectively, this house would make the next James Bond a female requires, like, I'm just going to sketch out what I think the debate is, right? I think the debate is one where there are two ways of tackling it. Either one way is to show that there's a massive benefit and incur in a change in social perceptions that you happen to lead to because of this effect, where you have to bluff up on either side the importance of James Bond and how this affects the progress for gender egalitarianism. Or another way for you to win this is to say, look, I'm not going to try and change society and engineer things. I'm just going to try and make the world a slightly better place. I think both approaches work. But I mean, strong prop arguments, there are two things that you can approach. One is to analyze James Bond's gender dynamics closely and talk about how in reality currently it's really damn misogynistic. The Bond girls and James Bond and the power dynamics and dialect between them basically means that, like, not only in terms of dialogue, a lot of these Bond girls are shown as like very, very dependent and useless or like reliant upon James Bond, but also that they are literally little more than just femme fatale, fatalistic because, or like that are fatal because of some men that are driving the fatality or fatalism, etc. So that therefore means is that you might want to say this is a motion about changing the misogynistic setting of James Bond in the films, about Bond girls, about the actresses, about how actresses are seen in the entertainment industry, or maybe just like literally stopping women from being misrepresented in these films and start using James Bond to send out a better message and say that there's an obligation on behalf of MGM or the studios to present James Bond, etc., to not be actively misogynistic. A second prop argument or second prop line, which you can expand into, is like basically to talk about why is James Bond so uniquely important, but also in the sense that what its signaling function currently does, which is largely, women are dependent, reliant upon men, men are strong, mysterious, James Bond is so powerful, and a man, a man who crosses all boundaries, and like literally even M, his supposed superior, is not as powerful as him. By the way, M was a woman, but most interestingly, she died. Yes. So James Bond effectively is presented as the like hyper-masculinity, hyper-sexualized man. And there's also an implicit judgment that basically says, we don't think women can do this sort of things. It's very exclusive. So what casting the next James Bond as a female does is, in movies, talk about how women are therefore represented and crafted. Outside movies, talk about how the actresses are now, capable of doing many things like negotiating contracts and gaining the spotlight, etc., because of the uniqueness of James Bond. And finally, about how this changes the perceptions of women on a societal level, etc., which I think is important to concretize and impact and say, what does this mean, right? This means maybe girls might now find new role models and take up things like pursuing things that are quite traditionally male associated or seen as hyper masculine dominated, like becoming a police or a fighter or a spy or political officer, etc., or police officer, and like changing the norms and expectations in that sense. It's also ultimately about the fact that you want to talk about the uniqueness of James Bond being a female in its impact to how we talk about women or imagine women from the point of view of men in general, like the view that these things are exclusively men operate and only men can be James Bond. By having a woman, you shatter a lot of these gendered narratives and limits within the entertainment industry. So you can do two levels of impacting. You're running a case that I mentioned, like the second case, right? Number one, impact it in terms of general society. Number two, in terms of the industry. And number three, you might, if your opening takes all of that, then in closing, you just reframe the debate and talk about the moral obligation and responsibility of the people that produce James Bond. So you switch the perspective away from talking about societal impact and talk about what I, as a studio, should do. Or you might even want to talk about, if it's a first person perspective, this house as MGM would cast the next James Bond as female, why this is a good thing for MGM Studios, why it's an interesting move for them in that sense. Upline to this argument probably would want to focus on things like, what is the realistic imperative? What realistically would James Bond look like as a female? Because recognize like storylines, tropes, and all that still exist, right? Like you're still bound by the background and the history of James Bond. So the first argument you might want to run on up is basically you want to counterprop the idea of having another action heroine, an independent action heroine like Black Widow, like not just in the Marvel comics, not just appearing as a bunch of Avengers comics or films, but literally having like Scarlett Johansson appearing as an independent female action hero. And you have to then analyze, you know, why exactly is this mutually exclusive with having the next James Bond as female whatsoever? And perhaps you can say, why is it harmful on the prop side? Because it creates several and perpetrates harmful narratives about women. And number one, women can only derive success because of pre-built legacy, right? That you're only attractive as James Bond because people found the backbone or the storyline of James Bond previously very attractive. Second of all, in terms of how the large majority of audience that are loyal to James Bond will react. So perhaps a bit more on like the whole anti-PC opposition and the whole framing of PC seeping into culture and why exactly that's a really not an ideal thing. And finally, perhaps a bit more specifically about James Bond, about why having women operating in these contexts would still be perpetrating sexual binarisms and conceptions of sex that are conception of gender roles that are hyper dominated by sex. Like why James Bond as a franchise in itself is just an awfully sexually patronizing thing, and why, you know, in that sense, the underlying constructs won't change, the underlying incentives won't change, and all we get here is a woman being forced into a position that she's highly uncomfortable with, playing a lead character in a still very patriarchal setting. But obviously you have to do a lot of analysis to say why the incentive structures are awash. So like talk about film directors, talk about the fan base, talk about the franchise, talk about sponsors, talk about what all of these reasons mean. They're unlikely to have a lot of freedom. You're not likely to have a lot of freedom as a casting director or a scriptwriter to change the script entirely to make it non-misogynistic. So that's why it won't happen in itself. I think that's an important op case to run. And if that's all taken by O, I think in that case, what CO should focus on is what kind of narrative does this create about like the actress that becomes James Bond? Like, because the imagination of her as powerful comes from a setting where she performs a lot of masculine tasks. Like presumably James Bond's attractive because of the action and all of sorts of things that are like, you know, very strongly ritualized gender, about the way they're dressed, about the way they look, like the suits and all that. Like if you can analyze from CO why you think none of the stuff that OG talked about in terms of changing the way things look actually happen in real life, and then talk about why pushing women into a context where she often is embodying through every act and every speech act that she makes the patriarchal history of James Bond. And then run a comparison to say why not having such a female figure participating in this sort of production is a better outcome. If you improve that, then that could be a potentially winning CO extension. But as I said, I think it's a bit of a prop-weighted motion. It's not like fully prop-weighted, but I honestly think that are very good reasons for us to pursue this motion. Anyway. So I think overall can win by really nailing down who do you think watches James Bond? Like, whom are these people? Why are they loyal as a fan base? To which OG or like CG might just say, look, fan loyalty and fan base support of a certain franchise changes because A, the fans change, like some die and some are born. B, fans' preferences change, like some are gained and some are lost. And C, fans' preferences can be manufactured. So therefore the fan loyalty point doesn't really stand. But obviously that's a matter of another discussion. Let's see. Next question. Okay. So this is a question about, there seems to be some tension between the idea that gender is not innate at all and transgenders feeling that they are born with a different gender from their sex. How do you believe gender identities are formed? Would you need to substantiate these claims and notions in debate? Okay. This is actually super interesting. Like this. So an effective summary that I personally believe, and this is a stance that I personally argue, is this. Gender is socially constructed. But social construction doesn't mean that's not important. Like the feeling and the intensity of it doesn't negate the fact that you still feel very strongly that you have a certain gender affiliated with you. But more importantly, for trans individuals, I think it's the view that the gender that they're most comfortable with is non-compatible with the sex or the body or the physical characteristics that they're in. And that is, or alternatively, the feeling that they don't think the gender is suitable to the body that they have. So either they seek to change, and most often in the cases they change the body, the physical characteristics, the apparatuses they have. I think an important distinction is to say, sure, gender is socially constructed, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about it. If I myself choose to say, I don't want to change my gender to fit my body, I find it very difficult emotionally to do that, then even if I could change it, even I could construct my gender otherwise, I can't. Because I can't emotionally bring myself to do it. And that's all that matters. Because if I can't bring myself to change my gender, and I feel that right now my gender demands a proper sort of like physical sex or physical body that is not what I have currently, if I feel so uncomfortable, then the best way out of this for me is to embrace my trans identity and to let my very strongly preferenced gender influence and alter my body. And in that sense, I think therefore you can say, okay, it's socially constructed, but that doesn't mean that we should stop caring about trans, because it's not about whether or not you could change it potentially. It's about whether or not you as an individual subjectively have the emotional capacity of changing it, and you don't. And personally, the government has no right to force you to change your gender to suit your body, because that's just outrageously non-autonomous and creates a lot of course, anti-utility or disutility. And finally, it's about the fundamental nature that even if your gender is indeed imagined and constructed by society, if you're an individual who believes that your gender is therefore something that you're happy with, there's no one who has the moral right to say, you must change your gender to fit your non-gender characteristics. And I think that is where you can still maintain a strong and robust defense of trans rights, despite acknowledging the constructivism of gender as a process overall. Any other questions? I'll be on until around 5:50. Sorry, I'll be on for another 6 minutes. Terribly sorry, because I've got to rush off to something in 15 minutes. Sorry. Okay. So there's a new question. Let's see. New question. Scroll down. Let's see. Terribly sorry. Internet connection's quite awful. Whew. This test would allow opponents of abortion to sign legally binding contracts with pregnant women. Okay, so for the benefit of everyone, the motions in discussion here are two things, right? First of all, propping round 2 in Oxford Women's 2016, so it's basically a debate about clause in employment contracts, and round 5 in Oxford Ivy last year. So round 2 I find quite straightforward. I think this is basically a debate about payment gap and wage gap. So there are two things that I think needs to be done by OG. One is to say, in most developed societies, coercive pressures and coercive structures are mitigated by factors like your right to speak and your freedom of speech as a woman, and also other things that prevent implicit coercion, i.e. you're trying to preempt what O is going to say, which is, women will be coerced, and this is a form of binding coercion, or like, even if there's no coercion, it's not right for you to sign a Ulysses contract effectively during your employment, or to give up your job in the process. So that's the first preemptive bit. But the most important bit from motion that needs to come out is this: the characterization that right now in the status quo, there's a fear, like an innate fear, that women, because of pregnancy-related reasons or maternity health-related issues, are not sustainable workers that can be employed in a workplace for a permanent time. And employers often fear that women getting pregnant would cause, like, a disruption in employment where they have to take maternity leave, get benefits and all of that. That is why there's what we call a wage gap, where men are tending to be paid a lot more than women in most industries. What this debate is therefore about is about changing employers' incentives and changing how they feel towards women. Whether or not you can guarantee the employment of women and heighten the wages and offer more in order to gain the labour services of women in that sense. I think it's important to talk about how employers react in that sense to hiring decisions, but also why this therefore benefits a vast majority of women, because if they enter into a workplace, they're more likely to get things like promotional opportunities or access to things that they previously would not have, because they tend to be seen previously as like a liability. They might get pregnant sometime, and that would cause them to drop out of labour and work, etc., which is not a good thing for job place continuity. Note that the underlying characterization that needs to be emphasized in OG is that men are not raging misogynists, and that they don't necessarily believe women are less competent, but that a large part of wage gap can be attributed to the very fact of fear of pregnancy and like related issues that are specific to only women. And note further that for OG to win this debate, you have to do lots of weighing to basically say, we agree ultimately that some certain section of women who are in a workplace may not feel comfortable because they now are denied their reproductive rights in some sense, right? But you can say that this reproductive right, or the choice to have children when you're in a workplace, there's still a choice for you to leave the employment, right? So there's still some sort of choice and exit option that's there in that sense, and like they're paid ultimately to not get pregnant, or they would presumably be fired. However, for many women right now who have yet to enter the market, for many women right now waiting to climb up the corporate ladder, for many women who have yet to, acquire the highest positions they wish to be in a corporate entity, or even just trying to scrape by as a mid-tier, middle-level office worker, they're getting paid a lot less than what they deserve. So this is a weighing between the majoritarian needs and a minority that you argue have some exit options to cater to and provide for. So that's how I think the OG case would work for this motion. Second of all, in terms of like legally binding contracts with pregnant women. Okay. So I think this is a debate where I think a really good team could win by lots of framing about what's going on right now with the choice mechanism. So frame this debate as one about autonomy and choice, and say, when a woman decides to make a decision about her own baby, if a woman genuinely hates and dislikes the baby for reasons other than monetary reasons, then they would not opt into these contracts. So the people that we're talking about here, you say, are women who, because of financial pressures and reasons of fear about economic insecurity, adopt or undertake abortion that actively contradicts their second order preferences when they actually really want to have the kid, but they can't because of the fact that they can't pay for the kid. So you say that this motion is about satisfying the second order preferences of mothers who want to bear children, but have to give them up because they fear that they live in poverty or will live in poverty. And I think a lot of like mecking needs to be done in order to show that there's no coercive element, etc., etc. But I think overall it's important to talk about how this benefits existing pregnant women in terms of like childcare and all that. And second of all, in terms of how this affects the relationship between the pregnant women and their potentially abusive partners. That if they can sign this contract, they don't no longer need to rely on their abusive partners to protect them and like who may harass them, etc. in relation to like their baby and forcing them to have an abortion, etc., etc. Third of all, I think it's also important to preempt O's point, which is like a lot of women who otherwise would not have abortion, or no, would have an abortion, would now be switched to not having an abortion, and this contradicts the interest and all that. You have to, I think, frame away this or prevent this or preempt this by talking about how women's decisions making actively function in those cases and analyze the fact that, you know, the monetary incentive probably isn't enough to force women who genuinely have strong reasons to oppose abortion to switch to not aborting the kids. So they're therefore out of the picture in that sense. And I think finally it's a bit more about the way that dialect or the way that narratives of anti-abortion groups work. Because right now a lot of the anti-abortion groups can obfuscate and say, look, women are only doing this because they're too poor. And like there's a lot of this false belief that, oh, abortions only happen because women care about money. If it is shown that there are women that don't take up the offer of financial incentive to not have an abortion, then this surely illustrates and basically defeats a lot of the narratives of those who oppose abortion because they think it is a reckless act. This surely reinforces the ability for those people who genuinely want to undertake an abortion regardless of economic consequences to do so with ever more determination, because this effectively shows that they have a legitimate means and legitimate ends to achieve through abortion that extends beyond the selfishness and economic obsession. So I think that also actually deflects a lot of the economic narratives that would come up otherwise against abortion legalization or what have you. So I think that's probably the way the argument should be fought out. It's really important to run a principle argument at PM to say this is about autonomy. And autonomy is not just about satisfying what you want to do on a first level or like the first order. It's about what you on a second order genuinely want. So like for instance, right, I might have a second order preference of becoming a singer. My first order preference is I'm really poor. I want to get a job. I want to go to be an intern at some like, you know, bakery or something, just like feed my family. So I give up my singing training sessions. I don't train with, I don't know, Christina Aguilera or whatever. I don't know how to train myself and develop myself in singing. So I effectively, even though I have a fundamental desire to become a singer, I give up this desire because of more pressing and first order concerns. Same analogy applies to women who's like, I actually really want to become a mother, but I'm forced to give this up because I just don't think I can take care of my kid and don't think I can take care of my child as appropriately and as well as I could. And this is about satisfying the fundamental desires of women in that sense, and actually about the autonomy and choice of women in those instances. And I think the framing, and if done successfully, could not only frame away O's like coercion objection, but also sustain a very strong case for OG to at least take a second, even in a very tough room. Yeah, that's it. Any other questions? If not, thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for this workshop. It was genuinely enjoyable. And yeah, please let me know if you have any feedback or comments. Thank you very much for listening in and tuning in. I hope to see you all in person soon or shortly. And please feel free to add me on Facebook. I'll just post my Facebook name on the YouTube chat here. Go, Brian Wong. Yeah, so my name is Brian Wong on Facebook. Please feel free to add me and message me with any questions you have whatsoever. I'd love to answer them. Thank you, everyone, and sorry I couldn't stay for longer, but thank you in general, and I hope you enjoyed the workshop. Thank you.